A teen at the bus stop stole my cash, singed my hair with a lighter, and whispered he has no idea while holding a knife to my face. When I stood up, flashed my badge, and told him to stay put, he screamed, "Holy shit, he can see." I didn't say another word. That was 4 months ago. Yesterday, I saw him in court, staring at the floor, while his mother sobbed in the gallery. The boys at the bus stop thought they were harassing an innocent blind man. They didn't know I was an undercover federal agent who saw everything they did. I've been sitting at the bus stop for 3 hours, pretending to be blind, waiting for my target to make the dead drop in the trash can 10 feet away. My dark glasses and white cane sold the act perfectly, while I memorized every face that passed, looking for the arms dealer who'd killed 3 federal agents. What I hadn't expected was a group of teenage boys deciding I'd be their entertainment while they waited for their ride. The first one, a kid wearing a varsity jacket with Josh stitched on it, waved his hand an inch from my face to test if I was really blind. When I didn't flinch, he turned to his friends and mouthed, "Watch this," and stood directly in front of me making obscene gestures with his hips, thinking I had no idea what was happening. My jaw clenched, but I kept my eyes unfocused, unable to break cover when I was this close to catching a killer who'd been evading us for 2 years. Josh's success emboldened his friend Chris, who crept up behind me and held up his middle fingers right behind my head, while another kid, Matt, pulled out his phone for photos. They started posing around me like I was a tourist attraction, making bunny ears and pretending to punch me, until Chris actually placed his crotch inches from my face for a photo, all in complete silence, thinking I was oblivious to their photo shoot. After they'd gotten their photos, Josh's eyes landed on my wallet sticking out of my jacket pocket. He slowly slid it out while watching my face, counted the bills, and pocketed $60 before dropping the wallet by my feet. "Sir, you dropped your wallet," he said innocently, handing it back empty while his friends suppressed laughter, thinking I'd never know he'd robbed me. The easy theft made Chris bolder, and he went for my grocery bag next, quietly opening it to see what else they could mess with. He pulled out my sandwich, looked at his friends with a grin, and spit a huge wad of mucus onto it before carefully rewrapping it and placing it back. Matt grabbed my medication bottles while Chris was rewrapping, switching the pills between them and mixing heart medication with antibiotics. Matt's pill switching gave him another idea, and he picked up my white cane from beside the bench. He smacked me hard across the shins, then quickly passed it to Josh, who immediately said, "Some kid just ran by and hit you. Are you okay?" They developed a rhythm, passing the cane between them for hits while the others pretended to comfort me and blame phantom attackers, each strike harder than the last. Then Josh pulled out his lighter while pretending to check if I was hurt. He held it close to the back of my neck as he examined me, close enough that I could feel the heat, then got bolder when I didn't react and actually singed my hair. The smell of burning filled the air, but they kept up their worried act, Chris saying, "Someone's barbecuing nearby," to explain the smell while Josh held the flame against my jacket collar until it scorched. While Josh was burning me, Chris had wandered to the nearby trash and found a dead pigeon crawling with maggots. He came back and quietly dropped it in my grocery bag with my contaminated sandwich. And when a woman walked by gagging at the smell, Matt jumped in to tell her I was homeless and always smelled that way, that I probably didn't even notice the stench anymore. That gave Josh his worst idea yet. He whispered something to his friends, who all grinned, then quietly unzipped his pants and stood right beside me. The hot stream hit my legs while his friends filmed on their phones, all of them silent except for suppressed laughter as they recorded what they thought was the ultimate prank on someone who'd never know what happened or who did it. Still riding the high of what he'd just done, Josh pulled out a knife and held it right in front of my face, moving it back and forth an inch from my eye to show his friends I couldn't track it. "He has no idea," he whispered, then pressed the tip against my cheek. That's when my target finally approached the trash can with the briefcase. I exploded from the bench, ripping off my sunglasses and sprinting toward the dealer, tackling him to the ground just as he made the drop. Behind me, I heard Josh scream, "Holy shit, he can see!" I cuffed my target while looking back at the 3 boys frozen in absolute horror, Josh's knife clattering to the ground, his pants still unzipped, my piss-soaked legs visible to everyone at the bus stop. "Federal agent," I called out, my badge now visible. "Stay right there!" My hands were still shaking as I kept my knee pressed into the dealer's back while fumbling for my phone with one free hand. The warm wetness of Josh's piss was already cooling against my legs and dripping onto the concrete beneath me. I managed to dial the emergency number we used for immediate backup while the 3 boys stood frozen about 10 feet away. Josh had taken 2 steps backward before I barked out that fleeing the scene after assaulting a federal agent was a federal crime, which made him stop like he'd hit a wall. My body camera had been recording the whole time, hidden under my jacket collar, capturing everything they'd done for the past 20 minutes. The dealer beneath me tried to twist free, but I pressed harder, feeling the adrenaline finally hitting as sirens grew louder in the distance. 2 unmarked vans screeched up to the curb and agents poured out, some heading for the dealer while others secured the briefcase from the trash can. I pointed at the 3 teenagers and told the agents they needed to be detained too, for assault on a federal agent, armed assault, and battery. Josh immediately started crying that his dad was a lawyer, while Chris bent over and threw up all over the sidewalk. Matt's phone clattered to the ground with the video still recording everything. The agents cuffed all 3 boys while Josh kept sobbing about his father and how this was all a misunderstanding. By 4:15 p.m., I was sitting in my car in the federal building's parking garage after changing into spare clothes from my trunk. The smell of urine was still in my nose even though I'd scrubbed my legs raw in the bathroom with paper towels and hand soap. Director Hayes knocked on my window, and when I rolled it down, she told me the dealer was the priority and the kids were being processed, but their parents were already calling senators. My jaw clenched as I realized these rich kids were probably going to walk away from this. Back at my apartment that evening, I stood in the shower for 40 minutes, scrubbing my skin until it burned red. I could still feel Josh positioning himself beside me, still smell the lighter singeing my hair, still feel that knife tip pressing into my cheek. Tracy called 3 times, but I let it go to voicemail because how could I explain that I'd let 3 teenagers do those things to me for a case? The next morning, Director Hayes called me into her office to watch the body camera footage on her laptop. When it got to the part where Josh unzipped his pants, I had to leave the room and threw up in the bathroom down the hall. The image was crystal clear, and the audio had captured every whispered plan between them. Hayes said it was enough to bury them, but the Brennan family had already hired Kellerman and Associates, and they were pushing the story that I'd entrapped minors. On day 3, I had to give my formal statement at Arlington PD since the assault technically fell under their jurisdiction. The detective kept asking why I didn't identify myself sooner, and actually said the words, "You let them escalate for 20 minutes, like I'd wanted it to happen." I explained about the arms dealer who'd killed 3 federal agents, but he wrote something down that looked like a loud incident to occur from where I was sitting. In the parking lot afterward, aide Jennifer Park caught up with me and said she was taking this case personally, because what they did was torture, not pranks. She showed me Josh's Instagram on her phone where he'd posted about pranking a fake blind guy with laughing emojis after his parents bailed him out. 4 days later, I was walking through the federal building lobby when Richard Brennan stepped out from behind a pillar with 2 other men in expensive suits. He said we needed to discuss my entrapment of his son and how I'd clearly violated federal protocols by not identifying myself. Security started moving toward us, but not before he asked loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear what kind of agent lets teenagers urinate on him for a case. The next morning, Hayes called me into her office and told me I was suspended from fieldwork pending an investigation. She said it was protocol when there's a a complaint filed, and the Brennans were alleging I deliberately allowed the escalation to manufacture federal charges against their son. The arms dealer case I'd spent 2 years building would continue without me, while 3 teenagers who tortured me became the reason my career got derailed. 2 days later, I was sitting in the federal counselor's office, a requirement for agents involved in traumatic field incidents. She asked me to describe how I felt when Josh held the knife to my face and whether I was afraid. I told her I wasn't afraid because I was too busy calculating whether breaking cover to stop him would be worth losing the dealer we'd been hunting for 2 years. 12 days after the incident, my phone rang while I was making breakfast and Sofia Delgado's name appeared on the screen. I answered and heard her crying before she even spoke, her voice breaking as she told me Chris had been throwing up for days. She said he couldn't sleep and kept saying he was sorry over and over, that he wanted to come apologize to me in person. I gripped the phone harder as she begged me to let her bring him to my apartment so he could tell me himself how sorry he was. Josh's dad being a lawyer makes me wonder if that's why he felt so safe doing all this in broad daylight. The way he immediately cried about his father when caught suggests he's used this card before to get out of trouble. The ADA had already warned me that any contact with the defendants could hurt the case, so I had to tell this desperate mother no. She sobbed harder and said Chris wasn't eating, that he just sat in his room staring at the wall, and I could hear him crying in the background. I told her I couldn't see him, and she hung up without another word, leaving me standing in my kitchen with cold eggs on the stove. 2 days later, I was sitting in the juvenile courthouse watching the 3 boys stand before the judge as the prosecutor read the charges out loud. Josh stood there with his shoulders back and a small smirk on his face, while his father sat behind him in a $1,000 suit. Chris was shaking so hard his lawyer had to steady him, tears running down his face as each charge was read. Matt just stared at his shoes, his hands clasped in front of him like he was praying, his parents sitting rigid in the gallery. The prosecutor listed assault on a federal officer, armed assault with a deadly weapon, battery, theft, and biological assault, each charge making Chris sob harder. Josh's lawyer immediately entered a not guilty plea with this confident voice like the whole thing was ridiculous. Chris could barely get the words out when asked how he pleaded, choking on his tears as he whispered not guilty. Matt's voice was so quiet the judge had to ask him to repeat himself twice before anyone heard his not guilty plea. The defense lawyers all argued for release to parents, talking about their clients' clean records and good grades and community ties. The judge set bail at $50,000 each and ordered them to have no contact with me or each other except through lawyers. After the hearing ended, I was walking down the courthouse hallway when Richard Brennan stepped right in front of me, blocking my path. His face was red, and he got close enough that I could smell his coffee breath as he started talking about Josh's Harvard admission. He said I could have stopped them any time, but chose to let it continue, that I was ruining his son's life over a prank. Before I could respond, Sofia appeared and grabbed his arm, pulling him back while yelling that his son pissed on a human being. She asked what was wrong with him, her voice echoing off the marble walls as other people stopped to stare. Richard tried to pull away from her, but she kept her grip, telling him his son was a monster who tortured a helpless man. Security guards rushed over and separated them, escorting Richard toward the exit while Sofia stood there shaking with rage. I walked to the parking garage alone, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my car keys, the confrontation replaying in my head. 2 days later, I was in my apartment bathroom when my partner knocked on the door, and the sound made me jump so hard I dropped my toothbrush. I couldn't use public restrooms anymore because every time I heard someone unzip their pants, my whole body would tense up and I'd start sweating. I'd started carrying spare clothes in my car and my office because I kept having these panic attacks where I'd feel wet even though I wasn't. My partner Tracy had suggested I talk to other agents who'd been assaulted on duty, but I couldn't explain why this felt different. Getting shot at or punched was part of the job, but having someone piss on you while you sat there helpless was something else entirely. The next day, I was sitting in Jennifer Park's office as she spread out papers across her desk, showing me what the defense had filed. They were painting me as a rogue agent with a history of excessive force, bringing up 2 shootings from my record even though both were ruled justified. She showed me a document requesting my therapy records, explaining that my sessions about the assault would become evidence for the defense. They wanted to prove I was mentally unstable, that I deliberately traumatized 3 innocent kids to boost my ego or something. Jennifer warned me this was going to get ugly, that they'd dig into every aspect of my life to discredit me as a witness. 2 days after that, I drove to the Arlington School Board meeting, even though Jennifer had told me not to go anywhere near it. The parking lot was packed, and I could see news vans setting up outside as parents streamed into the building. I slipped in through a side door and sat in the back row, watching the room fill up with angry parents demanding answers. Some were wearing Free Josh t-shirts, including half the varsity football team who sat together in matching jerseys. A mother stood up and said boys will be boys, that the whole thing was blown out of proportion by the media. Another parent shot back that their varsity athletes had become torturers, that the school had failed to teach them basic human decency. The arguments got louder and more heated, with people yelling over each other about accountability versus ruining young lives. The principal spotted me in the back and gave me this sad nod, like he understood why I was there even though I shouldn't be. I left before the meeting ended, walking past Josh's teammates who glared at me like I was the enemy who destroyed their friend. 2 days later, I was at the federal building when Agent Rivera pulled me aside in the hallway with a grim look on his face. He told me the arms dealer had made bail, $2 million cash that his lawyers posted within hours of the judge setting it. The guy was probably halfway to Venezuela by now, Rivera said, shaking his head at how the whole case had fallen apart. The case I'd sacrificed my dignity for was crumbling while those 3 kids were at home playing video games and posting on social media. Rivera admitted that half the office thought I should have broken cover the second Josh pulled out that knife. He said some agents were calling me an idiot for letting it go that far, for choosing the case over my safety. I wanted to explain that I'd waited 2 years for that dealer, that 3 agents had died trying to catch him, but the words stuck in my throat. That weekend I was at the grocery store reaching for cereal when I saw a white cane leaning against the customer service desk. Someone had left their mobility aid behind and suddenly I couldn't breathe, my chest tightening as memories flooded back. I dropped the cereal box and stumbled backward, knocking into another shopper as I gasped for air in the middle of the aisle. An elderly blind woman heard the commotion and carefully made her way over, asking if I was okay with genuine concern in her voice. I couldn't tell her I was having flashbacks to 3 boys attacking someone they thought was just like her, someone they saw as helpless. She stayed with me until I could breathe normally again, never knowing why a stranger had a panic attack at the sight of her cane. 2 days later, I was in a conference room for my video deposition, 3 defense lawyers sitting across from me with laptops and legal pads. They played my body cam footage on a big screen, pausing every few seconds to ask why I didn't react to specific moments. When Josh waved his hand in front of my face, they asked if I was enjoying the attention, if I got off on tricking kids. They replayed Chris spitting on my sandwich 5 times, asking each time why I didn't stop him if I really cared about my food. When we got to Josh urinating on me, his lawyer actually suggested I could have moved, but chose not to, implying I wanted it to happen. He asked if I had a fetish for that kind of thing, if I'd set up these boys to fulfill some sick fantasy. The other lawyers jumped in with questions about why I'd let it escalate, why I'd waited so long to reveal myself, what I was really thinking. They wanted to know if I'd done this before, if I had a pattern of entrapping minors, if I got a thrill from the power dynamic. By the time we finished, they'd twisted everything everything to make me look like a predator who'd manipulated 3 innocent boys for my own satisfaction. 2 days after that deposition, Jennifer called me while I was eating lunch to tell me about Matt's lawyer reaching out with an offer. He wanted to make a deal where Matt would testify against the other two in exchange for just community service, no jail time. The video from Matt's phone was apparently even worse than what my body cam caught, showing angles and audio the defense didn't want in court. Jennifer played me a clip over the phone where Josh was saying the blind guy couldn't do shit to them, that they could do whatever they wanted. You could hear Chris suggesting they could take my wallet and no one would believe a blind man over 3 honor students. The video showed them high-fiving after Josh pissed on me, laughing about how I'd have to sit there smelling like urine all day. 10 days later, Tracy walked into my apartment and found me hunched over my laptop scrolling through Josh's Instagram. She looked over my shoulder and saw what I'd been collecting for hours. Screenshots of him dumping a tray on a kid in a wheelchair, videos of him throwing garbage at a homeless veteran outside a 7-Eleven, photos of him and his friends standing around a keyed Honda Civic with the caption, "Teacher shouldn't have failed me." Tracy sat down beside me and started going through the posts herself, finding more stuff I'd missed. Him shoving a freshman into a locker, stealing lunch money from younger kids, even a video where he's laughing while Chris holds down a kid and Matt films. This isn't his first time, I told her, and she asked if that made me feel better, but it didn't. It made it worse knowing how many people he'd hurt before me. 2 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop when a woman approached my table and said she recognized me from the news coverage. She told me she'd been across the street that day at the bus stop and saw everything but was too scared to help because Josh's dad owned half the commercial real estate in Arlington. She handed me her business card and said she'd testify if needed, then admitted she thought I was actually homeless at first and didn't want to get involved with street people. Richard Brennan really thinks he was going to Harvard is a good defense for his son turning people into human fire hydrants. Coffee breath and bad parenting skills seem to go hand in hand here. 3 days after that, we were in the courthouse for the preliminary hearing where the judge took the body cam footage into his chambers for private review. When he came back 20 minutes later, his face was pale and he said in 30 years on the bench, he'd never seen that level of calculated cruelty from teenagers. He denied Richard's motion to dismiss and set the trial date for 6 months out, adding that he was strongly considering trying Josh as an adult for the armed assault with a knife. Richard stormed out of the courtroom cursing about activist judges while his wife followed behind, texting on her phone. 5 days later, Arlington High School called to inform me they'd suspended all 3 boys pending the trial outcome. The principal explained that Josh's parents had immediately filed an injunction to get him reinstated, while Chris and Matt's families had accepted the suspension quietly. He also mentioned that several students had come forward with their own stories about Josh, but their parents wouldn't let them testify because the Brennans were threatening to sue anyone who spoke against their son. 2 days after that, Director Hayes called me into her office at the federal building. She told me the arms dealer had been picked up in Mexico, and my bust was solid. But instead of feeling relief, I just felt rage that I wasn't there for the interrogation because 3 kids had derailed my whole career. Hayes then mentioned the Bureau was considering transferring me to a desk position for my own well-being, which sounded exactly like punishment for being a victim. Tracy convinced me to try a support group 2 days later, but when I got there, I was the only man in a room of 15 women. When it was my turn to share and I explained what happened, several of them looked at each other like teenage pranks didn't really count compared to what they'd been through. I left after 20 minutes, finally understanding why male victims don't report anything when even other victims act like it's not real assault if the attackers are young. 3 days later, my phone rang at midnight, and it was Sophia crying that Chris had tried to kill himself. She was at the hospital and kept saying he'd left a note about not being able to live with what he'd done to me, that the guilt was eating him alive while Josh was posting workout videos and acting like nothing happened. She begged me to understand that Chris wasn't like Josh. He was just a follower who made one terrible choice, and now it was destroying him. Against Jennifer's advice, I went to the hospital the next morning and found Chris in the psychiatric ward with bandages on his wrists. He couldn't even look at me, just kept apologizing over and over and saying he wished he could take it back, that he'd give anything to undo that day. Then he whispered something that made everything click into place. "Josh said you weren't really human if you couldn't see," he said, and I realized Josh had spent weeks dehumanizing me to his friends to make the torture easier for them to participate in. I left the hospital and sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour, trying to process what Chris had said. 2 days later, Jennifer called me to her office and showed me what the tech team had pulled from Matt's phone. There were dozens of videos spanning 2 years showing Josh attacking people, always the vulnerable ones like homeless people, disabled students, elderly folks at the mall, always with Matt filming and Chris participating. Jennifer paused one video and pointed at the screen. "This is a pattern of escalating sadistic behavior, and you were just the first victim who could fight back." The videos went back to when Josh was 15, starting with pushing and shoving and gradually getting worse, spitting on people, stealing from them, and by the last year before me, he was using weapons and fire. 2 days after that, I was back in my apartment and couldn't stop watching the recovered videos on my laptop. I saw victim after victim being humiliated while Josh laughed and his friends cheered him on. An old man at a park getting his cane kicked away, a homeless woman having her belongings thrown in a dumpster, a kid with Down syndrome getting his face shoved in a toilet. I kept searching through them looking for something, maybe proof that I wasn't weak for not stopping them sooner at the bus stop, that their cruelty was practiced and perfected through dozens of victims before they found me. 3 weeks later, my phone started buzzing non-stop at 2 a.m. and wouldn't stop. I grabbed it to see dozens of texts and missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The first message I opened had a link to Twitter where hashtag #busstoptorture was trending with over 2 million views already. Someone had leaked my body cam footage, and the entire assault was playing on repeat across every social media platform. My phone rang again, and a reporter from CNN was asking for a statement about the video. I hung up, and it immediately rang again with Fox News this time. Within minutes, I had voicemails from every major news outlet wanting exclusive interviews about what they were calling the most disturbing assault footage they'd ever seen. Then the death threats started coming in, some for me for being weak, others threatening to kill Josh and his friends. Director Hayes called and told me to pack a bag immediately because they were moving me to a safe house until things calmed down. Tracy texted that reporters had shown up at her workplace asking about our relationship and whether I had PTSD from the assault. 2 days into the safe house, I sat watching my assault get dissected frame by frame on every news channel. Some commentators called me a hero for maintaining cover to catch a killer, while others said I was a coward who let children humiliate him. The internet had split into camps arguing whether I should have broken cover or not. Tracy visited that afternoon and showed me her phone where Chris had posted a public apology video from his hospital bed. He was crying and taking full responsibility for everything, saying Josh had pressured them, but that was no excuse. The comments under his video were brutal, thousands of people calling for his death. 2 days after that, my mom called from California sobbing because she'd just seen the footage on the news. She kept asking why I hadn't told her what really happened and wanted to fly out immediately to take care of me. I convinced her to stay home because I couldn't handle seeing my parents look at me like a victim. That same night, Josh started creating anonymous accounts to message me photos of blind people with threatening captions. "Accidents happen to blind folks" appeared with a photo of a blind man near train tracks. "Next time no cameras" came with a picture of someone's white cane broken in half. Jennifer Jennifer got a restraining order filed, but we both knew Josh was using VPNs and burner phones to hide his tracks. He was learning from his mistakes and getting smarter about his harassment. 2 days later, I had to testify via video link in the arms dealer case, but the defense attorney immediately attacked my credibility. He played clips of my assault on a huge screen while asking how the jury could trust someone who let children urinate on him. The dealer sat there smirking as his lawyer kept replaying the worst parts of the footage. The prosecutor objected, but the damage was done as the jury watched me getting pissed on by a teenager. After that disaster, Director Hayes mandated I see a federal therapist for evaluation. I sat in her office 2 days later as she reviewed my increasing anxiety symptoms on her clipboard. I told her I felt like I was being assaulted again every day. First by them, then by the system, now by the public watching it on repeat. She wanted to prescribe anti-anxiety medication, but I refused because the defense was already painting me as unstable. 2 days after therapy, someone keyed blind bitch into my car at the federal building parking garage. Security footage was mysteriously corrupted right during that time period, so we had no proof who did it. That evening, Richard called my personal cell somehow and said it was horrible about my car. He suggested maybe I should consider dropping charges before something worse happened to me or Tracy. Jennifer immediately filed witness intimidation charges when I played her the recording of his threat. 2 days later, Matt's lawyer brought him in to provide full cooperation with our investigation. Matt sat there detailing how Josh had planned escalating pranks on vulnerable people for years, keeping score of who could be most cruel. Josh called it hunting, finding people who couldn't fight back, and Matt showed us messages where Josh described me as the perfect prey. The messages went back 2 years with Josh bragging about assaults on homeless people and disabled kids. Then a mother contacted Jennifer after seeing the news coverage about our case. Her son with Down syndrome had been assaulted by Josh and his friends 6 months ago at a mall. Police had dismissed it as boys being boys because her son's disability made him an unreliable witness, according to them. She had photos of burn marks on her son's neck that matched mine exactly from Josh's lighter. Jennifer spent the next day building what she called a RICO-style case against them. This wasn't pranks, but organized torture of vulnerable populations over multiple years. She'd found 7 more victims in 2 years, all with disabilities or vulnerabilities, all dismissed by authorities because Richard threatened lawsuits. She told me I was the first victim who could actually fight back with federal resources. 3 days later, Tracy called me over to her laptop where she'd found something that made my stomach drop. Sofia Delgado had started a support website after hearing about other incidents, and within 48 hours, dozens of people were posting their stories about Josh. Chris saying Josh told them I wasn't really human if you couldn't see really makes me curious about how someone plants that kind of thinking in their friends' heads over time. A homeless veteran described how Josh and his friends had thrown lit cigarettes at him while he slept behind the library last winter. An elderly woman with a walker wrote about Josh following her for 3 blocks, making fun of how she moved while his friends filmed it. A disabled student from the middle school said Josh had dumped his wheelchair out of the school van and left him on the sidewalk. Each story followed the same pattern of picking vulnerable targets who couldn't fight back or wouldn't be believed. Tracy touched my shoulder and said I'd given them a voice, but all I could think was how many people had suffered while Josh practiced his cruelty unchallenged. 2 days later, the school board meeting erupted into chaos when over 50 parents showed up demanding answers. I sat in the back watching fathers whose disabled kids had been tormented standing up one by one describing incidents the school had ignored. The principal kept wiping sweat from his forehead as he admitted they'd received multiple complaints, but the Brennans always threatened lawsuits, and their donations to the athletic program made the board look the other way. One father whose autistic son had been Josh's target for months jumped up and yelled that they let Josh practice on their kids until he finally tortured a federal agent. The board members couldn't make eye contact with anyone as more parents revealed years of covered up incidents. The next morning, Chris showed up at the prosecutor's office without his lawyer and asked to make a full statement. Jennifer called me to observe through the one-way glass as Chris spent 3 hours detailing what Josh called his hunting club. He explained how Josh recruited followers by showing them videos of previous attacks and teaching them to pick victims who were already isolated. Chris's hands shook as he described how Josh kept trophy videos organized by victim type and date, treating it like collecting baseball cards. When Jennifer asked about disabled victims specifically, Chris said Josh told them disabled people weren't really human, that they were doing them a favor by giving their lives meaning through the attacks. Jennifer leaned forward and asked where Josh learned this philosophy, and Chris went quiet for a moment before saying Josh's dad taught him that some people were meant to be prey. Jennifer immediately started digging into Richard's background, and within 2 days she had university records from 30 years ago. Richard had been suspended from his fraternity for a hazing incident that left a pledge permanently paralyzed, but his family's lawyers got the records sealed and paid the victim's family for silence. She spread the documents across her desk, showing me 3 more incidents during Richard's college years where disabled students were targeted, and Richard was questioned but never charged. The pattern was identical to Josh's attacks, picking vulnerable people and using family money to make problems disappear. The FBI got involved that same week, opening a federal civil rights investigation into what they called a pattern of hate crimes against disabled individuals. Director Hayes called me into her office and said she was reinstating me to assist with the investigation because this went deeper than one kid's cruelty. She showed me reports from 3 different states where the Brennan family had lived over the years, each with similar complaints that got buried. This family had been doing this for generations, she said, passing down their hunting techniques like some sick tradition. I went back to the assault survivors therapy group that Thursday, and this time told them everything about the bus stop attack. The room went silent at first, then one by one other members started sharing their own stories about attackers from wealthy families who never faced justice. A woman who'd been assaulted by her boss's son said, I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for everyone whose attacker bought their way out of consequences. Another member, a man whose disability made him an easy target in college, said Josh was just one of thousands who thought wealth meant they could hunt people for sport. Richard struck back 2 days later with a press conference on the courthouse steps claiming I was leading a witch hunt against his family. He had a video expert with him who showed edited footage from the bus stop that made it look like I'd been aggressive first, cutting out all of Josh's initial actions. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with death threats from people who believed Richard's version, calling me a lying cop trying to frame an innocent kid. Tracy's boss called her that afternoon, suggesting she take some time off until things calmed down because clients were asking questions about her connection to me. But the next morning changed everything when the woman who'd been across the street at the bus stop called a press conference of her own. She had her own cell phone video from a different angle that showed everything Josh did before I reacted, completely destroying Richard's edited version. She looked directly at the cameras and said she was tired of being silent, that I showed more restraint than anyone should have to after what those boys did. The video went viral within hours, and hashtag Justice for Billy started trending as more witnesses came forward with their own footage and stories about Josh. The grand jury convened 2 days later and returned indictments against both Josh and Richard for federal civil rights violations, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. Richard's law firm released a statement that afternoon saying he was taking an indefinite leave of absence, and 3 major clients publicly announced they were switching firms. Josh was immediately remanded to juvenile detention after the judge reviewed evidence that he'd been cyberstalking me and other witnesses in violation violation of his bail conditions. 2 days after that, the arms dealer's trial concluded with guilty verdicts on all counts, despite his lawyer's attempts to paint me as an unreliable witness. The jury foreman spoke to reporters afterward, saying my willingness to endure that assault to maintain my cover proved my dedication to protecting the public. She called me Agent Williams by mistake, but said I'd sacrifice my dignity for public safety, and the jury recognized that the case was bigger than one agent's humiliation. 3 months after the arms dealer's conviction, Sophia sent me a thick envelope containing a letter Chris had written from the treatment facility where he'd been staying since his suicide attempt. The facility was one of those places with manicured lawns and private rooms that cost more than most people make in a year, but Sophia had mortgaged her house to get him proper help after finding him unconscious in their bathroom with an empty pill bottle. Chris's handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear as he described how Josh had been manipulating him since 7th grade, starting with small pranks on homeless people and slowly escalating to worse acts, always filming everything, always making it seem normal. He wrote that he knew he couldn't undo what he'd done to me, but wanted to testify against Josh to stop him from hurting anyone else. And the treatment facility's psychiatrist had attached a note confirming Chris was mentally stable enough to provide testimony. 2 days later, I sat in the courthouse watching Matt stand before the judge, his parents behind him as he pleaded guilty to simple assault in exchange for 500 hours of community service with disability organizations. His voice cracked when he described how Josh had normalized cruelty, making torture feel like a game until Matt was disgusted by who he'd become, and the judge accepted the plea while warning that any violation would result in immediate incarceration. Jennifer called me into her office that afternoon and spread out 32 files across her desk, each one a victim Josh had targeted over 5 years starting when he was 12. She showed me police reports, school complaints, and medical records documenting a clear pattern of escalation from verbal harassment to physical assault, always targeting vulnerable people, always getting away with it because his father paid off victims or threatened lawsuits. The FBI behavioral unit had requested the case files to study as an example of privileged psychopathy, noting that Josh exhibited all the markers of a serial predator who used wealth as a shield. Over the next few days, I helped coordinate testimony from 12 victims willing to face the Brennans in court, including a blind student Josh had pushed downstairs in 9th grade, a homeless veteran he'd set on fire while sleeping, and a disabled grocery store clerk he'd locked in a freezer for 20 minutes. Each story revealed the same pattern of recording the abuse, sharing it with friends, and having his father clean up the mess with money and legal threats. I tried returning to fieldwork the following week, but during a routine surveillance operation, I panicked when someone stood too close behind me at a coffee shop, my body remembering Josh's presence at the bus stop. My hands shook so badly I couldn't hold my coffee, and I had to leave the scene, compromising a 3-month investigation into a drug trafficking ring. The director called me into her office that afternoon and assigned me to desk duty temporarily, saying she couldn't risk my trauma affecting field operations, and I realized Josh had stolen my ability to do undercover work, another theft that couldn't be prosecuted. 3 days later, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit froze all Brennan family assets during their investigation into Richard's witness tampering and bribery schemes, leaving them unable to hire the team of high-powered lawyers they'd been assembling. Richard was reduced to a public defender who immediately sought a plea deal, but Jennifer refused anything less than prison time for both father and son, knowing she had enough evidence to take it to trial. Josh keeping trophy videos sorted by victim type like baseball cards proves that evil really does come with its own filing system these days. Chris comparing it to collecting cards makes my skin crawl because most kids just trade Pokemon, not pain. The Arlington community held a rally outside the courthouse that weekend, with hundreds of people sharing stories of abuse that had been dismissed or ignored by authorities. The school board announced mandatory empathy training for all students and zero-tolerance policies for targeting vulnerable individuals, while Josh's former teammates publicly apologized for wearing shirts supporting him, saying they hadn't understood the full extent of his crimes. That night, Tracy and I sat on our couch discussing the toll this had taken on our relationship, as she'd been getting therapy for secondary trauma from the death threats and harassment we'd received from Josh's supporters. She admitted she didn't know if we'd ever feel safe again, that she checked the locks 3 times before bed and had panic attacks when strangers approached me in public, and I realized Josh had victimized everyone in my life, not just me. 2 days later, I attended Josh's court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, where the psychiatrist testified that Josh showed no remorse for his actions, only anger at being caught. The evaluation revealed antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features, with Josh viewing his victims as props for entertainment rather than human beings, and during the testimony, Josh smirked and mouthed, "You're next to the psychiatrist," when the judge wasn't looking. The following week, Chris met with prosecutors to prepare his testimony, detailing how Josh had groomed him and Matt starting in middle school with small acts of cruelty that seemed like harmless pranks. Chris explained how Josh started by having them throw food at homeless people, then gradually pushed boundaries until they were committing serious assaults, always framing it as fun and making them feel special for being included in his inner circle, and by the time Chris realized it was wrong, he was too deep and too scared of Josh to stop. The hearing ended with Chris getting 6 months in juvenile detention plus 2 years probation, and over the next few weeks I tried to return to normal work at the bureau, but nothing felt the same anymore. My desk partner kept glancing at me with this look of pity every time someone mentioned assault cases, and other agents started avoiding me in the break room like being a victim with some kind of disease they might catch. One morning, Agent Stevens pulled me aside and asked if I really had to push charges when I'd already caught the arms dealer, completely missing the point that justice doesn't work that way, that you don't get to pick which crimes matter based on what's convenient for the bureau. 2 days later, the news broke that changed everything when Richard got arrested at his country club during his weekly golf game, FBI agents walking him out in handcuffs while his golf buddies watched in shock. The surveillance footage showed him in the club's private dining room, sliding an envelope with $50,000 to someone he thought was a juror, but was actually an undercover agent Jennifer had planted after getting a tip about his bribery attempts. Josh was there when they brought his dad into the courthouse in cuffs, and for the first time since this started, that smirk disappeared from his face as the judge revoked Richard's bail and ordered him held until trial. The story exploded on national news that night with headlines about wealthy privilege failing to protect predators, and Jennifer's office started getting calls from victims all over the country sharing similar stories about rich kids who tortured them and never faced consequences. Jennifer showed me the stack of emails and letters that kept growing, people thanking us for finally holding someone accountable, for showing that money can't always buy your way out of hurting people. 3 days later, Jennifer and I spent 12 hours straight in the conference room going through every piece of evidence, watching my body cam footage frame by frame, reviewing Matt's videos, reading through the victim statements from other homeless people Josh had targeted. Jennifer kept saying we weren't just prosecuting assault, we were prosecuting a whole system that let these kids think they could do whatever they wanted to, anyone they saw as beneath them. The trial strategy she laid out focused on showing this wasn't some isolated prank, but a pattern of hunting vulnerable people for entertainment, and she had me practice my testimony over and over until I could say it without my voice shaking. 2 days before jury selection, I had to meet with the court-appointed therapist who was helping me prepare for facing Josh at trial, and she warned me he'd try to intimidate me, try try to make me feel like a victim again instead of a federal agent. We practiced staying calm while discussing the worst parts of the assault, but I still flinched hard when she mentioned the urination, my whole body tensing up even though it happened months ago. She said that was okay, that the jury needed to see how it still affected me, how what Josh did left lasting damage that doesn't just go away. The jury selection took 2 full days with Josh's lawyers trying to pack it with rich Arlington residents who'd understand that boys will be boys, but Jennifer shot down every one of them with her challenges. The final jury had 3 people with disabilities who knew what it felt like to be vulnerable, 2 teachers who'd seen bullying destroy kids, and a veteran who understood what it meant to serve and protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Sophia took the stand on day 3 of the trial and broke down completely describing how Josh had changed her son Chris from a sweet kid into someone who woke up screaming from nightmares about what he'd done. She told the jury about finding Chris in the bathroom with a bottle of pills after his suicide attempt, holding the note where he called himself a monster who didn't deserve to live after what Josh made him become. 2 nights before I was supposed to testify, I was making dinner when a brick came through my apartment window with a note tied to it saying to drop the charges or Tracy would be next. The security camera from across the street showed someone in Josh's varsity jacket, but the face was covered, and within an hour, federal agents had me and Tracy packing bags to move to a safe house for the rest of the trial. The next morning, Jennifer opened the trial by playing my body cam footage on the courtroom's huge screen, and I watched the jury's faces go from curious to horrified as they saw Josh unzip his pants and piss on me while his friends laughed and filmed. Jennifer's opening statement was short and brutal, telling them this wasn't about pranks or boys being boys. This was about torture, about 3 teenagers who hunted vulnerable people for sport because they thought those people didn't matter. Josh tried to keep that smirk on his face, but his jaw kept tightening every time the jury looked at him with disgust, and when they played the audio of him saying he could do whatever he wanted because I was just some blind nobody, 2 jurors actually shook their heads in disbelief. When I finally took the stand that afternoon, my voice stayed steady through most of it until I got to the part where Josh pressed the knife against my face, and I had to stop for a second to breathe before continuing. I explained that I couldn't break cover because 3 federal agents were already dead, and their killer was walking toward that trash can, that every second counted in catching him before he disappeared again. Josh's defense attorney tried to make it sound like I should have identified myself sooner, like somehow that would have made it okay, and I looked him straight in the eye and asked if he really thought they would have stopped torturing a real blind person, if that would have made what they did acceptable. The next morning, Jennifer wheeled in 3 TV monitors and started playing video after video of Josh attacking people over the years, 32 separate incidents his friends had filmed thinking they were making funny content. The first video showed Josh dumping a homeless man's belongings into traffic while the guy begged him to stop, and I watched 2 jurors start crying when Josh set the man's sleeping bag on fire. Josh's lawyer kept jumping up objecting about prejudicial evidence, but the judge let every single video play, and by the 10th one showing Josh stripping a woman with a walker, the whole jury looked sick. The worst was number 23, where Josh and his friends surrounded a blind student at their school, taking turns hitting him with his own cane while he spun around trying to figure out where the attacks were coming from, and Josh's mom actually ran out of the courtroom when she saw her son laughing at the kid's terror. After 3 hours of videos, the judge called a recess, and I saw several jurors glaring at Josh like they wanted to hurt him themselves. That afternoon, Chris took the stand looking like he hadn't slept in weeks, and when Jennifer asked him about their activities, he broke down describing how Josh turned hurting people into a game with actual scoring rules. Chris explained through tears that Josh gave points for making victims cry, double points if they were disabled, bonus points for physical contact, and kept a running tally on his phone of who was winning each month. Josh suddenly stood up and screamed at Chris, calling him a fucking traitor, before 3 bailiffs wrestled him back into his chair, and the judge threatened to remove him from his own trial if he had another outburst. The next day, an FBI behavioral analyst took the stand and explained how Josh's pattern matched serial predators, who start with vulnerable victims to build confidence before escalating to riskier targets. She showed charts comparing Josh's behavior to documented cases of people who started with animals, then moved to humans, pointing out the same dehumanization process and lack of empathy, and said attacking a federal agent showed Josh felt completely untouchable. Josh's dad getting busted with $50,000 in bribe money at his fancy golf club makes me wonder if Richard taught Josh that rules don't apply to rich people, or if Josh taught his dad that lesson. During lunch break on day 3, Tracy met me in a secure room and held my hand while I tried to eat, but couldn't manage more than a few bites because watching all those videos had hollowed me out. Through the window, I spotted a woman I'd never seen before sitting alone in the hallway crying, and Tracy told me it was Josh's mom who'd finally realized what her son really was after years of making excuses. That afternoon, Josh insisted on testifying against his lawyer's advice, claiming I'd entrapped him and his friends into attacking me. But when Jennifer cross-examined him, he couldn't explain why he'd been hunting disabled people for 4 years before we ever met. She showed him the video of him burning my neck and asked if he thought that was funny, and he actually said he thought I couldn't feel it, so it didn't matter, which made several jurors shake their heads in disgust. The next morning, Josh's coach and teachers came in as character witnesses, but Jennifer destroyed them one by one, getting the coach to admit he'd caught Josh hazing younger players by making them strip naked and run through the school, but Richard had threatened to sue if he reported it. The English teacher admitted she'd received multiple complaints about Josh bullying special needs students, but was told by the principal to handle it quietly because the Brennans donated so much to the school. Jennifer then dropped her biggest bomb, introducing emails between Richard and Josh where Richard called disabled people drains on society and worthless eaters, plus texts where he coached Josh on exactly what to say if he ever got caught to avoid consequences. She pulled up 3 generations of Brennan police records showing Josh's grandfather, father, and now Josh all had assault charges, proving this was learned behavior passed down through privilege and never facing real consequences. The victim testimony day was the hardest to sit through, as 12 people described how Josh had destroyed their lives, starting with the blind student who dropped out of school after months of Josh's torture. The homeless veteran Josh had attacked 7 times testified via video from a psychiatric facility where he'd been hospitalized after attempting suicide, saying Josh made him feel like garbage that deserved to be thrown away. A grocery store worker with Down syndrome lost his job after Josh's video of him went viral with the caption, "Retard bagging groceries wrong," and his mom had to testify for him because he was too traumatized to face Josh. By the time the 12th victim finished talking about how Josh had stolen his prosthetic leg and thrown it in a pond while filming him trying to hop after it, even Josh's own lawyer looked disgusted with his client. During closing arguments, Josh's lawyer made one last desperate attempt, arguing that teenage brains aren't fully developed, and Josh was just performing for his friend's approval, trying to paint him as a misguided kid who made bad choices. Jennifer destroyed that narrative by showing the timeline of Josh's attacks, starting when he was 12, methodically escalating over 5 years, proving this wasn't adolescent misjudgment, but calculated predation by someone who believed wealth made him untouchable. She ended by playing my body cam footage one more time, forcing everyone to watch Josh piss on me while I sat there unable to break cover, and told the jury they'd never forget what they saw because she sure couldn't. The jury only deliberated for 3 hours before sending sending a note that they wanted to review the video evidence again, and Josh's lawyer immediately moved for a mistrial, claiming the videos were too prejudicial, but the judge denied it, saying pattern evidence was perfectly admissible. Richard watched from his own custody hearing in the courtroom next door, his empire crumbling as he finally understood that all his money couldn't buy his son's way out of this, that decades of teaching Josh to see certain people as less than human had led straight to this moment. 3 weeks passed before verdict day arrived, and I found myself pacing the courthouse hallway while the jury deliberated, my stomach churning as I watched other victims' families clutching each other on the benches. The bathroom door swung open, and Josh walked out alone, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame after months in custody, and when he saw me, his mouth opened like he wanted to explain something. "You tortured 32 people," I said before he could speak, cutting him off completely. "Nothing you say matters." His face went slack with genuine shock, like he couldn't process that I wouldn't listen to his excuse, that his victims were actual people who could reject him. The bailiff called us back, and we filed into the courtroom where the jury foreman stood with the verdict sheet trembling in his hands. "Guilty on all counts," he read, his voice steady through each charge: assault on a federal officer, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, federal civil rights violations, conspiracy to commit assault. Josh collapsed forward in his chair while his mother's sobs filled the courtroom, her designer dress crumpling as she doubled over in the gallery. The judge ordered Josh remanded immediately to custody pending sentencing, noting the exceptional cruelty of his crimes for the record, and 2 guards lifted him from his chair when his legs wouldn't work. Down the hall in the other courtroom, Richard's jury returned their verdict simultaneously, guilty of conspiracy, witness intimidation, and bribery. The Brennan empire built on 3 generations of privilege crumbling in a single afternoon. Guards led Richard past Josh in the hallway, and he screamed at his son with spit flying from his mouth. "You destroyed everything!" Still not understanding that he'd created the monster by teaching Josh that certain people weren't really human. Outside the courthouse the next morning, victims and their families embraced each other, many crying with relief that justice had actually come. The blind college student Josh had first targeted grabbed my hands and said through tears that I'd given them justice they never thought they'd see. But I felt hollow inside, because justice couldn't erase the feeling of Josh's piss on my legs or the smell of my burning hair. Chris's sentencing came the next day, and the judge gave him 2 years probation with mandatory therapy and 1,000 hours of community service at disability organizations, noting his genuine remorse and cooperation with prosecutors. Sophia hugged me outside the courtroom and whispered her thanks for seeing that Chris wasn't Josh, but we both knew Chris would carry this guilt forever, that some mistakes can't be undone. Jennifer called me into her office the following day to discuss the pre-sentencing report, which recommended Josh be tried as an adult given the pattern and severity of his crimes against vulnerable people. Josh's lawyer was desperately seeking a plea deal, but it was too late because the case had become about more than just my assault. It was about every vulnerable person society had failed to protect. 2 weeks later, I sat in the packed courtroom as the judge pronounced Josh's sentence: 12 years total, 5 for the federal assault on me, and 7 for civil rights violations, to be served in adult facility after he turned 18. "You hunted human beings for sport," the judge stated, looking directly at Josh. "You're not a child who made mistakes. You're a predator who must be separated from society." Josh screamed obscenities as guards dragged him from the courtroom, his voice cracking as he cursed everyone, including his own parents. Richard's sentencing came the next day, and he received 8 years federal prison for conspiracy and witness intimidation, his law license permanently revoked, and his assets liquidated for victim restitution. The mighty Brennan family name that had opened doors for decades was now synonymous with privileged cruelty, and Richard shuffled away in shackles, finally experiencing the powerlessness his son had inflicted on others. I tried returning to fieldwork 4 days later, but had my first panic attack during a simple surveillance operation when a group of teenagers approached my vehicle, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold my radio. The director made the call that afternoon, permanently reassigning me to training new agents because my undercover days were over. Josh had stolen my career along with my dignity. The liquidated Brennan assets established a victim compensation fund within a week, and each of Josh's 32 victims received restitution checks, though no amount of money could erase the trauma he'd inflicted. The homeless veteran Josh had tortured used his settlement to get housing and substance abuse treatment, calling me to say he finally had a chance at life again. Small victories in an ocean of damage that would never fully heal. Day 175 found me back in the therapist's office, my hands gripping the armrests as I finally said what I'd been holding back for months. The words came out rough and angry, admitting I wasn't mad about maintaining cover, but about living in a world where teenagers felt safe torturing someone helpless. The therapist nodded and helped me see that my endurance had exposed something bigger, a whole system that let predators like Josh thrive unchecked. 5 days later, a letter arrived from Chris's treatment facility, his handwriting shaky as he described working with disabled adults and learning to see them as people. He wrote about waking up sick every morning remembering what he'd done, about trying to become someone who would have stopped Josh instead of following him. Reading it made my chest tight because redemption takes time, but at least he was walking that road. Tracy and I tried to build something normal on day 185, going to restaurants and watching movies like the death threats never happened, but we both jumped when cars backfired, checked the locks 3 times before bed, kept looking over our shoulders even though Josh was locked up. Josh's brain suddenly discovering consequences exist after 12 years of hunting people for fun makes me think his lawyer should have pleaded temporary sanity instead. Clearly rational thought was the real shock to his system here. Recovery wasn't some place we'd arrive at, but a choice we made every single day to keep going. The Bureau called me in on day 190 to teach new agents about maintaining cover under extreme stress, using my case as the example. I stood in front of 20 fresh faces and told them their mission mattered, but so did their dignity, that knowing when to break cover was the hardest choice. They looked at me with respect that made my stomach turn because I didn't feel like someone worth respecting. Matt's supervisor at the Center for the Blind called on day 195 to update me on his progress, saying he was dedicated but clearly haunted by what he'd done. The supervisor said Matt had become excellent at guiding people who couldn't see, understanding finally that his pranks had been torture, not jokes. He'd finished his service hours, but like Chris, he'd carry the weight of who he became under Josh's influence forever. Day 200 brought news that families were filing civil suits against Arlington School District for ignoring Josh's behavior for years. The district settled fast, agreeing to new reporting rules and protection protocols for vulnerable students, making Josh's legacy the policies that would stop future predators. Sometimes justice comes through paperwork and policy changes instead of handcuffs and prison sentences. My last therapy session came on day 210, the therapist asking how I felt about everything that had happened since the bus stop. I told her I'd never be the same agent, that parts of me were broken in ways that wouldn't heal, but maybe that was okay. I still flinched at certain sounds, still carried extra clothes everywhere, still couldn't use public bathrooms without my heart racing. But 32 victims had gotten justice because I endured 20 minutes of hell at that bus stop. The scars would always be there, the memories would never fade completely, but I was learning to live with them one day at a time. As I walked out of her office for the last time, I realized the story that started at a bus stop had finally reached its end. Thanks for letting me wonder right alongside you. Definitely been something sharing these moments. Until next time, like the video, it helps more than you think.